Hi, I'm McKenna Dillingham, and this is my book report presentation. So the book that I decided to read was called The Man They Wanted Me to Be by Jared Saxton, and he is an op-ed reporter for the New York Times. And so a little bit about this book. He starts out talking a lot about it. So the book is about toxic masculinity, and he talks a lot about four main subjects. So he talks about the patriarchy, toxic masculinity, expectations, and then fighting back from those expectations. So a little bit about this book. He starts out with his experiences covering the Trump administration and his realization that the Trump administration and the type of people that were at these rallies were very similar to the men that he grew up with. And so he talks a lot about his experience. So his mom was married first to his biological dad, and then throughout this rest of the story she has 4 additional husbands. And he talks about how each of them was a different part of this toxic masculinity. A lot of them had grown up in these toxic homes with abusive parents and had really kind of struggled. And so he grew up as someone who identified more feminine, and that was something that was kind of beat out of him from a really young age because that wasn't socially acceptable within his family dynamic in the Midwest. And so I thought it was a really powerful book. He talks a lot about the expectations that other people had for him, and how because of those expectations and because he wanted to be considered a man and didn't want to be abused anymore, he didn't want to be taken advantage of, he didn't want to be made fun of at these family parties, and so he started to kind of lash out, and he had addictions that he struggled with, and just struggled with all of these things, parts of his personalities. But there were a couple of quotes that I felt were really poignant from the book that I wanted to share. So the first one says, "Undoubtedly, unchecked toxic masculinity is one of the biggest threats to American women." And throughout the book, he talks a lot about the impact that this toxic masculinity had on his mom, as well as on different women throughout his life that he saw struggle because of the actions of the men that they were involved with. The second quote says, "Men are conditioned to become emotional strangers to themselves." And so he talks a lot about how, like we've talked about in course content, at the beginning, a lot of times the male counterparts are more emotional and more delicate, for lack of a better word, than their female counterparts. But as they grow up, they're conditioned not to be these things. And he talks a lot about the dangers of becoming emotional strangers because they don't know how to express themselves through anything other than violence. And that's what this next quote talks about. It says, "The truth is much more complicated. In their childhood socialization, men are taught that masculine characteristics are more desirable and feminine ones are unacceptable, thus rendering women as second-class citizens. Men lash out in violent ways because it is their only acceptable form of communication to exhibit violence." And he talks a lot about the importance of allowing men to have different ways that they can express themselves and that they can cope. And throughout the rest of the book, he ends up finding a good role model in his grandfather, who's very emotional and sensitive and very in touch with his emotions, and people don't judge him for that because he was a war veteran. And so throughout the rest of the book, Jared talks about how he was able to change his ways and how he now is an advocate for men so that they can fight against these expectations of toxic masculinity. So there is my book report.